Welcome to the Node.js Technical Steering Committee for July 16th, 2020. We'll follow the agenda that we had posted in the issue, which is issue number 893, along with a few additions that were suggested in that issue as well. Before we get started, any announcements that people would like to share?
I don't think so.
Okay, so no announcements this week. I think moving on to the CPC and board meeting updates. The main thing I did want to mention is that there were some updates to the foundation bylaws. I've opened in the CPC repo an update that just gives a little bit more information on that. I'll post that into the minutes in case anybody is interested in looking at that. And of course, the bylaws themselves are available at bylaws.openjsf.org, so you can go take a look there as well. The other thing is that the board meeting is next week, so I'm not aware of anything in particular to bring up, but if I've forgotten something, please remind me, or if there's something new, just let me know. Any questions, comments before we move on from that one? Okay, if not, we'll move on to the issues that were tagged for Node.js/Node. So the first one is issue number 34260, which is the tag next 10 years of Node. That's a follow-on to a session we had at the Collaborator Summit, which is talk about what we think led to the success of the first 10 years of Node, and to try and do some planning or strategy around what do we need to do for the next 10 years of Node to make sure that we remain as successful as we've been in the first decade. We did have a session today. I put it on the agenda here as an FYI, just to make sure all the TC members knew that it was happening. In there, we talked a bit about logistics, and it sounds like we're going to try for a 2-week cadence. The first thing we dove into a little bit, carrying on from the discussion we had at the Collaborator Summit, was around, not a roadmap, because we don't necessarily I don't think that here's a roadmap of what's in versions makes sense, but something at the level that talks about, what our priorities are in terms of, we've seen some projects have we value this, but we value, in terms of priorities, but we value this above that. And to have something that sort of, communicates when you're making a decision in the project, what's going to go into that and what kind of priorities do we think we have as a group of collaborators. And then going along with that, at the next level, something that says, here are the things we think are strategic for Node being successful in the next 10 years. And again, being something that says, if you come to the project with work in those areas, that should be something that the project says, oh yeah, those are strategic, so we want to bring those in, and to help us also hopefully have some perspective on what we think it's important to do. So we talked about actually creating a file which is going to be at the top level of the Node repo, and to put some content in that as our next step. And I'll stop there. If people are interested, please come and get involved. I think that it should be some very interesting discussions, and hopefully it'll help people coming to the project understand where we're coming from, because I think we have a lot of these already. We just don't necessarily have them written and down in a way that people can find them. The next issue is 34054, proposal to create a trash team to manage the backlog. I think we discussed that fairly well last time, and Jarish was going to go off and make a PR to start to pull some of that into our governance. So I don't know if there actually needs to be any more discussion, and whether we should just take off the agenda tag.
But one thing.
Go ahead, Miles.
But one thing I wanted to add really quickly, I had a conversation with someone about this, and just positive uses of the triage role, thinking about when you might want to use it, when you might not want to use it. And one of the cases where they were talking about the triage role potentially being very helpful was especially in finding things that people can do and get involved in the project And I was thinking a little bit about like some of the logic that we had. Rich, you were actually one of the people who pushed for this, and I think it was great, around the original collaborator summit onboarding stuff that we would do, that built out a Node.js, and we would, have all these small patches that was definitely like busy work, but like that work onboarded folks and helped them to do stuff. So I think that like, while we could argue that like, a lot of the triage work of labeling things is something that can be done by a bot, some of it is not all automated, and maybe there is actually room here to create onboarding paths for folks who may not have ways to get involved anyways, even if it's duplicating a little bit of effort, even if it's not the most efficient or effective way to do that work. It could be a great way of onboarding more collaborators.
Seconded.
And so
Yeah, that's a
I
good
know,
way.
yeah, I know that I was not necessarily the most supportive of it when we were first talking about it. So I just wanted to kind of come back with some more elaborate thinking after I've talked to some more people about it.
Yeah, and we're not really going to know how this works out until we try it. It might be terrible. It might be great. We're going to find out. That's my feeling anyway.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to name the folks I was talking to because I didn't ask for permission for that, but I think that they have been working on some ways to like improve this and look at creating triage roles in other projects. So I'm going to likely try to borrow from some of that, and see if I can get some of the work that they've been doing to help like reference or influence how we can maybe do it.
That sounds good. And, Jarish, who's been very active in doing that in the Express repo, is going to bring that knowledge and context as well. So hopefully we can learn from what they've done there too. And what I'm blanking on that. What would we call that? We called it a collaborator where we had people, and we helped them with the first commit.
That was Code and Learn when it was.
Code and Learn, right? Yes. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds good. Are we? I think Rich, you were going to say something too.
No, I think I said it eventually.
Removing from the TSC agenda, does that make sense to people?
Yeah, we can always add it back.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, I've just removed. We'll remove the agenda tag for now. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. The next one is remain the default branch for master domain or something similar. That one, I think we're really in a holding pattern, waiting just to see if we get more sort of pattern or tooling or whatever out of GitHub, but we're leaving it on the agenda so we don't forget it. I don't know if anybody else has any other updates or thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable for us to just be patient a little bit longer.
Okay. More pattern, more.
Seconded.
Sounds good. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. It's Bootstrap include bootstrapped environment and built-in snapshot. That's 32984. I think we did have a discussion last time, and Daniel Bevius was actually, diving in and taking a little bit more of a look. I know he did comment on the issue saying he's still working on that and has a bit of a holiday, but I think that was our next step. So we're probably just waiting on that.
Yeah, I think he indicated that he might have more to say in the issue tomorrow, and then he'll be offline for a while, but
yeah,
we can see how it goes next week.
Okay, so I'm just going to say Dan Bev is digging in. We'll wait until that completes before further discussion. And then the last item on the pre-tagged agenda is audit Google account access, which is 389. That's really just so that we don't forget. I haven't heard anything from Brian yet, so we haven't done it yet, so we'll just leave it on for now. So I know, Miles, you had a few things you want to add to the agenda. Do you want to take us through those? Let me just.
Yeah, I could talk Really briefly, just about one of them probably is the only one that really makes sense since there aren't a lot of us here. It was more just like an update to folks. So NPM 7 is being worked on. There's talk about how we get it into like, you know, both newer versions of Node as well as LTS. It's been an ongoing conversation happening over at the release team. There are some breaking changes. Obviously, it's a new Semver major version. Some of them are more disruptive than others. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is kind of go through and figure out like, you know, what are the Semver major changes that are Semver major for NPM versus the ones that would be Semver major for Node. The two big ones that seem like they could be disruptive to people's workflows. One is an update to, sorry, I got distracted. One is an update to how peer dependencies are resolved. And it's kind of debatable about whether or not like this would be a good thing or not. One could argue that like it's breaking because it's making things actually work properly and they haven't worked properly before. But it does mean that like the package locks and trees that would be created by NPM with this feature would be different. So one thing that we're exploring right now is actually perhaps cutting an NPM 7 and an NPM 8 at the exact same time, where the only real difference between the two would be whether or not that feature is on by default, so that we could ship 8 with 15, but land 7 on 14 and potentially 12. There was a lot of reliability work that was done and internal fixes and like a lot of improvements to NPM that are non-breaking. That would be a real shame to not get into LTS because of this one breaking change. The other breaking change that we were looking at that was potentially an issue was like the way in which lifecycle scripts, so that's like all the NPM run commands are run, has been completely revamped and changed. And one of the biggest differences is like a bunch of environment variables that were there before are no longer there. We're already getting user feedback about the ones that are going to be problematic, and we're kind of adding them back in as a legacy support. So I'm thinking right now that what we're probably going to aim to do, and what the release team has talked about, is we're aiming to cut a beta of 7 before the end of this month. We would like to land that beta onto master so that we could be spoke testing it with sitgims, so that we could be getting into the nightlies, getting some degree of feedback to make sure there's no major issues. That we would take that that feedback and then determine whether or not we would disable the peer dependency stuff and cut a version 8. And I think that the overall hope would be that we could have a GA release ready version of it in September with more than enough lead time that we could get something into 14 while it's still current, have it into 14 for at least 2 weeks, and hopefully get it into 12 before it moves into maintenance mode. And then exactly what the shape of those things would look like would likely depend based on feedback that we get from users and from core and what we see in the ecosystem as far as usage is concerned. So wanted to just update the TSC. I mean, like for most of the stuff regarding releases in LTS, like that's totally over on like the release team to figure out. But landing this beta on master is definitely something that gets into like the core teams and TSC's decision-making framework. We do have some prior art of landing dependencies with betas early. And at least from both the release team and the NPM team's perspective, and I guess I can't speak to everyone on the release team, but it seemed to be the general feeling in the room, was that especially since we're talking about larger changes, getting a beta in master sooner so people could be playing with it would be a really great way to like help make that decision in an educated way over the next couple months. And that like in general, like any other change, if it ends up being super disruptive, you know, we always could revert it or like revisit it later. But a lot of what we want to do is just like make educated, informed research decisions about this.
So from my personal perspective, the landing the beta in master, I think doesn't raise too many questions. Like I understand the thought there, and the for me, it's trying to get something with a list of breaking changes back into the earlier versions, where like personally, I would kind of like to understand, like, here's the list of Semver majors, and then along with them, like, why it's okay to have those breaking changes, you know, either why they're not breaking for Node or why it makes sense that they're okay. So it's, you know, that part is the, yeah.
We have that list.
Yeah.
And I could get someone like Roy or Isaac from the or Claudia from the NPM CLI team to come and chat with us about it if we'd just like to be updated on what they are. Having reviewed it myself, the two that I mentioned around lifecycle scripts, the environment variables related to that, and the peer dependencies, to me at least, appear to be the only ones that would like actually affect folks and how they do things. And a lot of the rest are like the internals have been massively refactored on top of Arborist. And it's one of those things where like there's a really big backlog of a lot of bugs and issues that haven't been dealt with for years, that this big refactor should be fixing a lot of them. I think another part of this, and this is part of like maybe a bit of a larger strategy to be discussed, is like, you know, the NPM team does have limited resources. We are exploring, you know, governance models that could help improve external collaboration, but we want to be like very realistic about the resources that we have. And if we can find a way to get 7 on 12 and 14, like a version of 7 that is okay, and then kind of punt all of the things that are kind of make us concerned into a version 8 that's only on 15, it would significantly reduce the maintenance burden to ensure that like we have active updates to the versions of NPMs that we're shipping. 6 and 7 is a big enough of a change that like maintaining 6 for another 2 years would be like pretty bad for the team overall and significantly eat into their ability to do feature work and ongoing maintenance. So
yeah,
that's
so
a big motivation here too.
I can definitely understand that. From the flip side, like, you know, you just said massive refactor is not the first thing I like to see go into the stable LTS, right? Like, so it's a matter of timing and understanding what that is, right? Like, it's like, hey, we finished this massive refactor yesterday, or we finished it 6 months ago and it's been out there, people have been using it, you know, that. So I think like your offer of getting somebody to come and bring us through all those, at least personally, would help, and I suspect for other people too.
Yeah, and I think with the timing, like a scenario that I personally would be comfortable with, and recognizing my bias of like, you know, who pays my bills here, but with the information that I've managed to put together, and with both my Node hat and my NPM hat on, I think like, I feel like we could safely do this in both 14 and 15, where we introduce a version that doesn't have those like really obvious breaking changes to 14 prior to going to LTS. And then based on ecosystem feedback, try to get it back to 12. I think that we could have a longer conversation about whether or not we can do that while 12 is in maintenance. 12 is also the first version that we're doing like a 12-month active, 18-month maintenance. So we have a 6-month shorter window to try to squeeze these things in. But I think with all of this, to be honest, like the real first step is us cutting that beta and getting it into master and seeing how it affects people, and then kind of iterating from there, and kind of seeing, you know, what makes the most sense.
Right.
And
yeah,
so
and for my, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I'll follow up with the team and get someone to come so we can get someone who's a little bit more familiar with all those issues.
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah, just sort of going through, here's the, I don't know, there's 10 breaking things or 20 or whatever, and this is why we don't think it's, because yeah, I'm not sure how everybody else will feel about that, but.
Cool.
Okay, any, I don't know, Rich, Tobias, Ruben, anything on that before we move on?
Not from me.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay, that, I don't think it really makes sense. We don't have too many people here from the strategic initiative side. There were a few updates. You know, Targus mentioned the update on V8 currency. V8 8.4 is landed on master, so that sounds like we'll have 8.4. And sorry, and there's a PR to backport it to 14.x, so it sounds like we will go to LTS with 8.4. And they're starting on 8.5 for, but there are some issues. Startup performance, you know, so there, Joey mentioned that there was some work on the issue she has opened. It was rebased and some additional issues were resolved. Again, appreciate more reviews. And then, you know, I mentioned that Dan commented that, you know, he started to look at dig into that in terms of the startup performance PRs. James mentioned that quick on work is ongoing, and on the build resources front, I don't have anything to update. And Miles mentioned that there's no major update for modules. So I guess actually we got pretty decent coverage there anyway. So. So anything people want to add before we close out for today? No? Okay, so let's call it for today. Thanks for everybody for coming, and we'll talk to everybody next time.
See you next week.
Bye.
See you around. Bye.